Sir, if you sign that document, thousands of retired workers will lose everything. The sentence cut through the boardroom so sharply that even the low hum of Manhattan traffic beyond the glass walls seemed to disappear. Every executive at the 40-foot conference table turned at once. Some blinked in confusion. Others frowned with open irritation. At the far end of the room, Charles Whitman slowly lifted his eyes from the contract resting beneath his hand. His silver Montblanc pen hovered inches above the final signature line. The woman who had spoken stood beside the coffee cart near the wall, one trembling hand still wrapped around a stainless steel pitcher. Maya Brooks, 20 years old, black, quiet, invisible until now. Her dark blue service uniform looked painfully out of place beneath the warm amber glow of the chandelier lights. A few executives exchanged amused looks almost immediately. One man let out a low chuckle beneath his breath. Charles leaned back slowly in his leather chair, studying her the way someone might study a problem they didn't have time for. "Excuse me," he asked calmly. Maya swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. "The liability transfer clause," she said softly. "Page 78. If you sign tonight, Whitman Capital becomes fully responsible for all pension losses connected to Kane Holdings after the merger closes." The room went still again. Outside the windows, rain streaked down the glass 32 stories above Midtown, turning the city lights blurry and cold. Victor Kane finally laughed. Loud, confident. "Charles," he said, adjusting the cuff of his tailored gray suit, "are we really taking financial advice from the girl serving coffee?" Several people around the table smiled politely. Maya's cheeks flushed, but her voice stayed steady. "It's hidden under the offshore restructuring language," she continued. "The wording redirects legal responsibility after the first quarter. If the retirement fund collapses, your company absorbs all damages." Charles tapped the contract once with his pen. "And how exactly would you know that?" Maya hesitated for half a second. "Because my father lost everything in a deal written the same way." The answer landed heavier than anyone expected. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Charles narrowed his eyes slightly. "You work downstairs, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Serving coffee." A few more quiet laughs spread across the room. Victor Kane smirked openly now. "This is unbelievable." But Maya stepped forward anyway. Her shoes pressed softly against the polished marble floor as she pointed toward the thick stack of papers near Charles's elbow. "Sir, please. Just read the final subsection before you sign." Charles stared at her for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, something colder settled across his face. "You know," he said quietly, "people spend 20 years building careers to sit at this table." Maya lowered her hand, but didn't move. Charles leaned forward. "You serve coffee. Leave finance to adults." The words hit the room like permission. Smirks widened. One executive shook his head in disbelief. Another muttered something about interns watching too many documentaries. Near the door, security had already started moving. Maya looked around the room once, desperate for someone, anyone, to say she might deserve 30 more seconds. Nobody did. Victor Kane slid the contract closer to Charles with a satisfied smile. "Shall we continue?" Charles never looked at Maya again. "Escort her out," he said calmly. Security approached. Maya stepped backward toward the doorway, heart hammering against her ribs, but just before she crossed the threshold, she turned one last time toward Charles Whitman. The rain behind him rolled down the glass like falling shadows. "If you sign that tonight," she whispered, "you won't just lose your company." Charles uncapped the pen. "You'll lose every person who trusted you." Then he signed. The sound of the pen scratching across paper barely lasted 2 seconds, but somehow it echoed through the boardroom longer than the rain outside. Maya Brooks stood frozen near the doorway as Charles Whitman calmly placed the signed contract back onto the polished oak table. Victor Kane smiled immediately, the kind of smile that appeared too fast to be genuine. Around the room, tension dissolved into low conversation again. Chairs shifted. Crystal water glasses clinked softly. Someone near the windows laughed under his breath as if the interruption had only been an awkward joke delaying dinner plans. But Maya could not move. Her stomach felt hollow. Security held the door open beside her, waiting. "Miss," the guard said quietly. She finally lowered her eyes and stepped out into the long marble hallway. The heavy boardroom doors closed behind her with a soft mechanical click that sounded strangely final. Inside the elevator, The stainless steel walls reflected the exhaustion on her face beneath the fluorescent lighting. She pressed the lobby button with trembling fingers. 32 floors down felt like an eternity. Her father used to look exactly like that before everything collapsed. Same expensive suit. Same confidence. Same belief that people with less power could not possibly understand anything important. She still remembered the night he came home carrying a cardboard box filled with office supplies after his pension company folded. The silence at the dinner table afterward had lasted months. By the time the elevator doors opened, the warmth had drained from her body completely. The lobby of Whitman Capital glowed gold beneath towering chandeliers, while rain hammered the glass entrance outside. Executives in dark coats crossed the marble floors carrying umbrellas and leather briefcases worth more than her monthly rent. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever really did. Maya walked toward the employee hallway near the service elevators, clutching the empty silver coffee tray against her chest. Halfway there, someone called her name. Maya. She turned quickly. Helen Whitman stood near the reception desk beside a tall arrangement of white orchids. Unlike the others upstairs, she did not look irritated. She looked unsettled. Her cream-colored coat hung loosely over her shoulders, and one hand tightened around her phone like she had been replaying something in her mind ever since the meeting ended. Mrs. Whitman, Maya said softly. Helen stepped closer. That clause you mentioned upstairs, she said carefully. Were you absolutely certain? Maya hesitated only a moment. Yes, ma'am. Helen glanced toward the private elevators. Charles does not usually ignore legal reviews. Predatory contracts do not look dangerous at first, Maya replied quietly. That is why they work. Helen stared at her for a few seconds longer than expected. There was no arrogance in her expression now, only concern. You studied finance? Maya nodded slightly. For 2 years. What happened? A faint sadness crossed Maya's face. Life got expensive. Somewhere behind them, thunder rolled across the city. Helen lowered her voice. Charles built this company from almost nothing. He trusts Victor Kane more than anyone. Maya looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Sometimes trust is the easiest thing to weaponize. Before Helen could answer, one of Charles's assistants hurried across the lobby holding a tablet. Mrs. Whitman, the car is waiting. Helen glanced back once more at Maya. I hope you are wrong, she said softly. Maya swallowed hard. Me too. Outside, black sedans disappeared one by one into the wet Manhattan streets, while high above them the lights inside the boardroom still burned against the stormy sky. And somewhere inside that tower, hidden beneath signatures, champagne, and billion-dollar smiles, the damage had already begun. By 6:30 the next morning, the rain had stopped, but Manhattan still looked washed in cold gray light. Maya Brooks sat near the back of a crowded city bus, her headphones silent against her ears, while downtown traffic crawled past fogged windows. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Charles Whitman signing that contract without even reading the final subsection. Around her, construction workers drank coffee from paper cups, nurses scrolled through phones, and exhausted office employees stared blankly at the morning news playing above the driver. Then the screen suddenly changed. A red breaking news banner flashed across the broadcast. Whitman Capital under federal investigation following pension fund irregularities. Maya's stomach dropped instantly. The anchor continued speaking while footage of Whitman Capital filled the screen behind her. Police vehicles lined the curb outside the glass tower. Reporters crowded the entrance beneath flashing cameras. Several older employees stood outside the building crying openly, while security barricades blocked the front steps. Early reports suggest retirement accounts connected to Kane Holdings may have been illegally transferred overnight during the merger agreement finalized yesterday evening. The bus grew quieter as more passengers looked up. One older man near the front lowered his newspaper slowly. My brother worked there 30 years, he muttered under his breath. Maya looked away from the television screen, but she could still hear every word. Thousands of pension holders may be affected. Her chest tightened painfully, not because she had been right, because she had hoped she was wrong. Downtown, chaos had already swallowed Whitman Capital whole. Inside the executive floor, phones rang nonstop across glass offices while assistants rushed through hallways carrying stacks of legal documents. Television screens mounted on the walls repeated the same headlines over and over again. Charles Whitman stood alone inside his office, staring through floor-to-ceiling windows at the streets below. The city looked different this morning. Smaller somehow. Colder. A half-empty cup of untouched coffee sat near his elbow while legal analysts argued quietly behind him. Victor Kane's accounts were emptied before sunrise, one attorney said carefully. Funds were routed offshore through 6 shell corporations. Another voice joined in. The liability transfer is legally binding. Whitman Capital now holds responsibility for all losses connected to the retirement accounts. Charles remained silent. His reflection in the glass looked pale beneath the steel-colored morning light. Somewhere deep inside the building, protesters had started gathering outside the lobby entrance. Their voices rose faintly through the windows 32 floors above the street. "Sir," another lawyer continued nervously, "the press is asking whether you personally approve the merger despite compliance concerns." That finally made Charles turn. "Compliance concerns?" he repeated sharply. The room fell silent. Nobody answered immediately. Then one younger analyst swallowed hard before speaking. "Security footage confirms an employee attempted to raise objections during the signing meeting yesterday evening." Charles felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. For half a second, Maya's voice returned so clearly it almost sounded like she was standing behind him again. "If you sign that tonight, thousands of retired workers will lose everything." Charles looked toward the conference room across the hallway. The doors remained closed now, but he could still remember the exact moment she pointed at the contract. Calm, certain, unafraid. His jaw tightened. "Give me the footage," he said quietly. Across the city, Maya stepped off the bus near a small community center in Brooklyn where she volunteered between shifts. The cold morning wind carried the smell of wet pavement and traffic fumes through the narrow streets. Her phone buzzed suddenly inside her coat pocket. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Slowly, she answered. For several seconds, nobody spoke on the other end. Then a familiar voice broke the silence. Low. Controlled. Different now somehow. "Miss Brooks," Charles Whitman said quietly. "I think we need to talk." The line went silent after Charles Whitman spoke, as if even he did not fully know what came next. Maya stood outside the Brooklyn Community Center gripping her phone tightly, while cold wind pushed loose strands of hair across her face. Cars hissed past on the wet street nearby. Somewhere down the block, a siren echoed between brick buildings before fading into traffic. "How did you get this number?" she asked quietly. On the other end, Charles exhaled slowly. He sounded older than he had the night before. "My wife gave it to me." Maya glanced through the glass doors behind her where volunteers arranged folding chairs for a food drive. "I am working right now, sir." "Please," Charles said, and the word surprised her more than anything else. Silence stretched between them for several seconds. Finally, Maya spoke again. "Did you watch the footage?" Another pause. "Yes." "Then you already know what happened." Charles lowered his eyes inside his office overlooking Manhattan. The city no longer felt like something he controlled. Reporters still crowded the street below like dark moving stains against the sidewalks. "I want to understand how you saw it before anyone else did." Maya looked down at the cracked sidewalk beneath her shoes. "Because people at the bottom learn to notice danger faster," she answered softly. Inside Whitman Capital, legal teams rushed through hallways carrying binders while television screens repeated the same devastating headlines. Pension fraud. Federal investigation. Retirement collapse. Charles walked away from the windows slowly and closed his office door for the first time all morning. The sudden quiet felt unnatural. "Victor Kane disappeared at 4:12 this morning," he said quietly into the phone. "Private jet to Switzerland." Maya shut her eyes briefly. Then the transfer already cleared. Charles sat heavily in the leather chair behind his desk. "Thousands of employees trusted me." "Yes," Maya replied. "They did." The answer hit harder because there was no anger in it. Only disappointment. Charles loosened his tie slightly, something he almost never did during business hours. "You said your father lost everything in a deal like this." Maya remained quiet for a moment before answering. "He worked 30 years for a manufacturing company in Ohio. Pension disappeared after a merger." Her voice softened. "One signature changed our entire life." Charles stared at the city skyline through the narrow gap between his office blinds. "I thought I was smarter than everyone in that room." Maya gave a faint, tired laugh without humor. That is usually when people stop listening. Somewhere outside his office, Raised voices erupted again as another news alert hit the building. Charles rubbed his forehead slowly. He had spent 25 years building Whitman Capital into one of the most respected firms on Wall Street. Now everything felt unstable, fragile, like glass moments before it shattered. "There is something else," Maya said suddenly. Charles straightened slightly. "What?" Victor Kane did not write that contract alone. The room around Charles seemed to grow colder. "What do you mean?" Maya looked back toward the community center doors. Elderly volunteers carried donated grocery bags past the windows, while children laughed faintly somewhere inside. Ordinary people. The same kind now losing retirement savings because powerful men treated greed like intelligence. "The language in subsection 78 was too precise," she said carefully. "Someone inside your company helped structure it." Charles felt his stomach tighten immediately. "Who?" Maya's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I do not know yet." Then she added something that made the blood drain from his face completely. "But whoever it is, they knew you would never listen to someone like me." Charles Whitman did not leave his office for the next 3 hours. Outside the glass walls, Whitman Capital was unraveling floor by floor. Phones rang endlessly across departments. Assistants whispered in tight circles near elevators. Television screens flashed collapsing stock prices beside footage of angry retirees gathered behind police barricades in the street below. Rainwater still clung to the windows, turning Manhattan into a blur of gray steel and flashing red emergency lights. But inside Charles's office, the silence had become unbearable. He replayed the boardroom security footage again, and again, and again. Maya Brooks stood frozen beside the coffee cart beneath the chandelier lights, her voice calm while every executive in the room dismissed her before she even finished speaking. Charles leaned closer to the monitor. This time he stopped watching himself. He started watching everyone else. Victor Kane had smiled too quickly. One legal advisor avoided eye contact the entire meeting. But another detail suddenly caught his attention. Richard Ellis, Senior Compliance Director, sitting halfway down the table. While Maya spoke, Ellis never looked surprised. Not once. Charles paused the footage carefully. Ellis had not reacted like a man hearing shocking information for the first time. He reacted like a man waiting to see whether someone else would notice it too. A cold feeling settled into Charles's chest. At that exact moment, someone knocked sharply on the office door. Helen Whitman stepped inside without waiting for permission. Her face looked pale beneath the soft lighting. "Charles," she said quietly, "federal investigators are downstairs." He muted the security footage slowly. "I know." Helen closed the door behind her and glanced toward the frozen image of Maya standing on the screen. "You believe her now?" It was not a question. Charles leaned back heavily in his chair. "I should have listened the first time." Helen crossed the office slowly, her heels soft against the dark wood floor. "You built this company by trusting your instincts." Charles gave a bitter smile. "No. I built it by trusting people who looked and sounded like me." The honesty in the sentence seemed to surprise even him. Helen looked down for a moment before speaking again. "Do you remember where I grew up?" Charles frowned slightly. "South Baltimore. My father cleaned buses for 30 years, she said quietly. People ignored him every day, not because he was wrong, because they decided his uniform meant he could not possibly know anything valuable." Charles stared at the paused image of Maya again. Her shoulders looked small beneath the oversized service jacket. Yet somehow she had been the bravest person in that entire room. His office phone suddenly lit up again. "Richard Ellis." Charles answered immediately. "Where are you?" Ellis sounded nervous. "At home, sir. I figured legal would handle most communication today." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Interesting." Silence crackled faintly through the speaker. Then Ellis laughed awkwardly. "Sir." Charles stood slowly and walked toward the windows overlooking the chaos below. "You never looked surprised yesterday." Another pause. Longer this time. "I am not sure what you mean." Charles stared down at the crowd gathering outside his building. Elderly employees clutched signs demanding answers while cameras flashed against the rain-dark sidewalks. "Maya Brooks warned us about the liability transfer." His voice remained calm now. Dangerous calm. "And you looked like a man hearing something he already knew." On the other end, Ellis stopped breathing for half a second too long. Charles heard it clearly. Then came the answer. "Too fast. Too careful. Sir, I think you are under a lot of stress right now." Charles closed his eyes briefly. Years of negotiation had taught him one thing above all else. Guilty people always rush to explain emotions instead of facts. "Do not leave town," Charles said quietly. That was not a request. He ended the call and turned back toward the frozen image on the monitor. Maya still stood there pointing at the contract while powerful men laughed at her. Charles swallowed slowly. Somewhere deep inside him, beneath decades of ego, status, and control, something painful had finally started breaking apart. Not his company. Himself. That night, Manhattan looked strangely quiet from the Brooklyn Bridge. The rain had finally disappeared, leaving the streets slick beneath rows of yellow traffic lights stretching into the distance like reflections on black water. Maya Brooks sat alone on a cold metal bench near the river, her thin coat pulled tightly around her shoulders while ferries moved slowly through the dark water below. The city skyline glowed across from her, beautiful and distant at the same time. Somewhere beyond those towers, Whitman Capital was still collapsing. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt tired. Her phone buzzed 3 times since leaving the community center. Unknown numbers. News reporters probably. Lawyers maybe. She ignored them all. A cold wind drifted off the East River, carrying the faint smell of salt, wet concrete, and engine smoke through the night air. Maya lowered her eyes toward the steaming paper cup between her hands. Her father used to bring her here when she was little after long shifts at the factory. They would sit near the water eating cheap hot dogs wrapped in foil, while he pointed toward Manhattan and told her that powerful people were not smarter than everyone else. They just have more people willing to listen to them, he used to say. At the time, she thought he sounded bitter. Now she understood he sounded hurt. Across the river, inside a penthouse wrapped in glass and silence, Charles Whitman stood alone in the kitchen staring at a bowl of untouched soup growing cold beneath soft overhead lights. Helen sat near the dining table watching him carefully. Neither had spoken much during the drive home. The television remained muted in the background, but the headlines rolling across the screen were impossible to ignore. Pension collapse. Federal investigation. Executive accountability. Charles loosened the top button of his dress shirt slowly. He looked exhausted now, older somehow, as if one terrible day had stripped away years of certainty. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked quietly without looking at Helen. She waited. Charles rested both hands against the marble counter. "I still remember the exact moment I decided she was not worth listening to." Helen lowered her eyes. "Because she served coffee." Charles laughed once under his breath, bitter and hollow. "Because she was young. Because she was black. Because she was standing instead of sitting." The silence after that felt heavy enough to touch. Outside the penthouse windows, helicopter lights drifted slowly across the skyline. Charles stared at his own reflection in the dark glass. For years, he had called himself self-made, disciplined, rational. But now another truth sat in front of him, impossible to ignore. He had spent decades trusting confidence more than character, status more than truth. Helen finally stood and walked closer to him. "What are you going to do?" Charles looked toward the muted television screen where frightened retirees stood outside, his building clutching folders and pension statements. One older man wiped tears from his face while speaking to reporters. Another woman sat alone on the curb, staring blankly at the sidewalk beneath flashing police lights. Ordinary people. People who trusted his signature more than they trusted themselves. Charles swallowed hard. "First," he said quietly, "I find out who inside my company helped Victor Kane." He paused. "And after that," his voice faded for a moment. Helen studied him carefully. "After that what?" Charles looked back toward the city skyline glowing beyond the windows. Somewhere out there, Maya Brooks was probably sitting alone believing nobody powerful would ever truly change. And honestly, he could not blame her. "After that," he said, softly, "I tell the truth, even if it destroys what is left of me." The next morning, the air inside Whitman Capital felt colder than the weather outside. Employees moved through the lobby speaking in whispers while television crews crowded behind police barricades across the street. The once polished rhythm of the company had collapsed into nervous silence. Nobody smiled anymore. Nobody walked with confidence. Even the marble floors seemed different now, reflecting exhaustion instead of power. Charles Whitman stepped out of the private elevator wearing the same dark suit from the day before. His eyes looked hollow from another sleepless night. Conversations stopped the moment he crossed the executive floor. People lowered their heads, some out of fear, others out of shame. He walked straight toward the compliance division without saying a word. Richard Ellis stood near his office pretending to review documents, but the second he saw Charles approaching, color drained from his face. "Charles," he said quickly, forcing a tight smile. "I was just preparing updated statements for the investigators." Charles stopped directly in front of him. "Close the door." Ellis obeyed immediately. Inside the office, the blinds were partially drawn against the gray morning light, leaving long shadows across stacks of legal binders and untouched coffee cups. Charles remained standing while Ellis adjusted his tie nervously behind the desk. "You knew about subsection 78, Charles said calmly. Ellis blinked. "I already explained yesterday, I did not fully review the 'do not insult me' by lying badly." The words landed quietly, but harder than shouting ever could. Ellis swallowed. Charles stepped closer. "You knew exactly what Victor Kane inserted into that contract." Sweat gathered near Ellis's temples now. "Charles, listen to me carefully. Everybody trusted Kane. Nobody thought Maya Brooks thought it." Silence. Thick and immediate. Charles stared at him without blinking. A 20-year-old girl serving coffee saw the fraud in under 5 minutes. His voice tightened slightly. "But my senior compliance director somehow missed it." Ellis looked away first. That was all Charles needed. The office suddenly felt very small. "How much did he pay you?" Charles asked quietly. Ellis shut his eyes for a moment. "It was supposed to be temporary," he whispered. Charles felt something inside him sink lower than anger. Lower than betrayal. "How much?" Ellis's voice cracked. 3 million. The number hung in the air like poison. Outside the office windows, sirens echoed faintly through Manhattan traffic below. Charles stared at the man he had trusted for almost 12 years. Golf weekends, family dinners, promotions, recommendations. And all along, greed had been sitting across from him pretending to be loyalty. Ellis lowered his head into his hands. "Victor said the losses would be hidden offshore for years. By then we would all be gone." Charles laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor left in it. "And you knew I would sign without reading every page." Ellis looked up slowly. Guilt spread visibly across his face now. "You trust people with credentials," he admitted quietly. "People with status." The sentence struck harder than Ellis probably realized. Because it was true. Charles looked toward the office windows where gray clouds drifted over Manhattan like smoke. Maya had seen the danger immediately because she was trained by survival instead of privilege. She noticed what powerful men overlooked because people like her could not afford mistakes. Charles finally stepped back from the desk. "Federal investigators are downstairs," he said quietly. Ellis's breathing stopped. "Charles, tell them everything." Ellis stared at him in disbelief. "You are handing me over?" Charles looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," he said softly. "You handed yourself over the moment you believed money mattered more than the lives attached to those retirement accounts." Then Charles opened the office door. 2 federal agents were already waiting outside. Ellis's face turned pale as they approached. But Charles barely noticed anymore. His thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere across the city where a young black woman had spoken the truth in a room full of powerful men and been ignored because of who she was. By late afternoon, the crowd outside Whitman Capitol had doubled. Rain clouds hung low above Manhattan again, turning the city dark hours before sunset. News vans lined the street while reporters spoke urgently into cameras beneath glowing studio lights. Behind metal barricades, retired workers clutched folders filled with pension statements and unanswered questions. Some looked angry. Others simply looked tired. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt hollow now, like a cathedral after everyone stopped believing. Charles Whitman stood alone in the executive conference room, staring at the same chair Maya Brooks had occupied near the wall 2 days earlier. The coffee cart was gone. The contract was gone. Even Victor Kane's nameplate had already been removed from the visitor desk downstairs. But the silence remained. Heavy. Permanent. Helen entered quietly behind him carrying a folded newspaper. The headline covered almost the entire front page. Wall Street executive ignored internal warning before collapse. Charles looked at it for only a second before turning away. "They are not wrong," he said softly. Helen studied him carefully. "The board wants you to release a statement tonight." Charles walked slowly toward the rain-streaked windows overlooking midtown traffic below. "A carefully worded apology?" he asked bitterly. "Probably." He shook his head. No more hiding behind statements. For years, Charles had mastered the language of corporate survival. Strategic regret, legal distancing, carefully polished sympathy designed to protect reputations instead of people. But somehow, after hearing Maya speak, those words sounded emptier than ever before. His office phone buzzed again behind him. Media requests. Lawyers. Investors. He ignored all of them. Then his eyes settled on something resting near the edge of the conference table. A small folded napkin. One of the catering staff must have missed it after the meeting. Charles picked it up absent-mindedly, but when he unfolded it, he froze. Numbers covered the inside in neat handwriting. Pension percentages. Offshore transfer estimates. Legal references. Maya's handwriting. She had been calculating the damage before anyone else in the room even realized there was danger. At the bottom corner, one sentence had been written smaller than the rest. People trust signatures more than promises. Charles stared at the words for a long moment without moving. Then slowly, he lowered himself into one of the empty leather chairs. The room around him blurred beneath the soft amber lights. For the first time in his life, success no longer felt impressive. It felt expensive. Somewhere across Brooklyn, Maya sat inside the community center, helping an elderly man fill out emergency pension assistance paperwork. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly while folding tables covered the room with stacks of forms, donated food, and half-empty coffee cups. Volunteers moved quietly between frightened retirees trying to answer questions nobody should have been forced to ask. "Will I lose my apartment?" One older woman whispered near the corner table. Maya looked up from the paperwork in front of her. "We are going to help you through this," she said gently. The woman nodded weakly, though fear still lingered in her tired eyes. A few minutes later, the front doors opened suddenly. Cold wind swept into the room, carrying the smell of rain and traffic. Conversations softened almost immediately. Maya looked up slowly. Charles Whitman stood near the entrance wearing a dark overcoat, his hands empty, his expression exhausted. Several people recognized him instantly. Tension spread through the room like a wave. Some retirees glared openly. Others looked away completely. Charles did not defend himself. He simply stood there absorbing the weight of every stare. Then his eyes found Maya across the crowded room. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights reflected softly against the wet pavement outside the windows while the city hummed somewhere beyond the glass. Finally, Charles walked toward her slowly. Not like a powerful executive anymore. Just a man carrying the full weight of his own mistake. The room stayed quiet as Charles Whitman stopped beside Maya's table. Outside the community center windows, rain began falling again in soft streaks beneath the yellow glow of streetlights. Nobody moved for several seconds. The retirees sitting nearby watched him carefully, their exhaustion heavier than anger now. Charles looked different without the polished confidence that used to follow him into every room. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath the dark coat, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had only days earlier. Maya slowly set down her pen beside the stack of pension forms in front of her. "You should not be here," she said softly. Charles nodded once. Probably not. He glanced around the crowded room. Elderly couples sat shoulder to shoulder filling out emergency assistance paperwork, while volunteers carried donated groceries between folding tables. Real people. Real consequences. Not numbers buried inside contracts. Charles lowered his eyes briefly. "Richard Ellis confessed this morning," he said quietly. "Federal investigators recovered offshore transfers connected to Victor Kane." Maya remained calm. "I figured they would." Charles gave a faint smile without humor. "You seem to figure out a lot before everyone else." She looked at the older woman sitting beside her before answering. "People who grow up losing things pay attention differently." The sentence settled heavily between them. Near the back wall, a television silently replayed footage of Whitman Capital surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. Charles noticed several retirees staring at the screen with hollow expressions. For years, his company logo represented stability, security, trust. Now it looked like a warning. He turned back toward Maya slowly. "I came here to tell the truth publicly." Maya studied him carefully, searching for arrogance, excuses, anything that sounded like another wealthy executive trying to save his image. But she found none. Only exhaustion and regret. The board already prepared statements blaming lower management. Charles admitted quietly. "Lawyers told me to distance myself." Maya leaned back slightly in her chair. But, Charles looked around the room again. But my signature is the reason these people are here. Rain tapped softly against the windows while nobody nearby spoke. Charles reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed a folded piece of paper on the table beside Maya. It was his resignation letter. Signed. Final. Tomorrow morning, he said quietly. I am holding a press conference. Maya glanced down at the letter without touching it. And what are you going to say? Charles exhaled slowly. That I ignored a warning because I decided the person giving it did not belong in the room. Several volunteers nearby looked up after hearing that. Charles continued anyway. I spent years believing intelligence looked a certain way, sounded a certain way. His voice tightened slightly. And because of that, thousands of people trusted the wrong man. Maya looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, she spoke. Most people with power only apologize after they lose everything. Charles nodded faintly. I know. And some never apologize at all. He lowered his eyes. I know that too. Silence returned again, softer this time. Not hostile, just honest. Across the room, one elderly man struggled to lift a heavy box of donated food near the exit. Without thinking, Charles walked over and quietly picked it up for him. The man hesitated at first, recognizing